All right. So this conference is actually in the service of a volume that's going to be published by Routledge in 2022, hopefully. May go over to 23, but hopefully in 2022, with the title Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Critical Perspectives on Freedom and History. And it's being co-edited by myself, Kate Paget-Walsh, and Sebastian Rand. And yeah, has the dual function of being a book on the philosophy of right for its 200th anniversary and for being a festschrift for Terry Pinkard. So, okay. I want to say a couple words about Terry before saying a couple words about the philosophy of right, and then getting us started. So, for me personally, Terry has just been an incredible advisor and mentor over these years. I first met him in the summer of 1998, I believe. My thesis advisor, who's here with us, Robert Pippin, had recommended him as an outside reader, and we had arranged to meet in Georgetown. And already on our walk to lunch, in response to my sort of fumbling attempt to present my early dissertation project, Terry had sort of gave a reframing of Hegel and modern, sort of all of modern moral philosophy that just sort of immediately illuminated the conceptual terrain and really transformed the whole field, like in a paragraph, into a sort of bright plane of inquiry. So I'm sure this is an experience that many of you have had in person or in reading Terry's works. I should also say, I think Terry's work has always been concerned with justice. And so organizing a festschrift around the philosophy of right in particular made sense. But I also don't think it should obscure the breadth of Terry's work and interests. I'm sort of always discovering new things that Terry can do and does. His interest in poetry, his writings on music, the fact that he's fluent in Mandarin, lots of things like that. And I'm sure there are many more that I don't know. So I wanted to just review a few things that most of you will probably already know with Terry's works, beginning with two early works from the 80s, Democratic Liberalism and Social Union, and Hegel's Dialectic, the Explanation of Possibility. I suspect that many of us first read Terry when the third book on the screen, Hegel's Phenomenology, Sociality of Reason, came out in 1994. I read that right when it came out in Robert Pippin's class, and sort of, you know, as I'm sure many of you did, kind of grabbed onto it as you're sort of struggling through the phenomenology, reading it for the first time, holding on for dear life, and finding just incredible guidance from Terry's book, which I think has held up very well now, some 27 years later. After that, Terry published a biography, sort of definitive biography of Hegel right now, that I'm sure we also all rely on, followed by a somewhat more expansive book on German philosophy, 1760 to 1860. His book, Hegel's Naturalism, from I think 2012, I think is just an amazing sort of bringing together of all the themes in Terry's previous work on Hegel, and sort of giving it integrating it with a lot of exciting work that had been done on Hegel's Aristotelianism, Mind, Nature, and the Final Ends of Life, a book that I go back to quite often and still find really inspiring. The last two published books, Does History Make Sense? I know that's a book that will be referred to at many points during this conference. Hegel on the Historical Shapes of Justice, in which Terry takes on the sort of difficult task of giving an account of reconstruction of Hegel's philosophy of history. And then most recently, though I suppose quite a long time coming, is Terry's translation of the Phenomenology of Spirit, which I at least sort of relied on in my teaching for, I don't know, a decade at least, through the Facing Pages edition that he had posted on his website. And now it's finally out and we can use it in our classes and have text of the phenomenology that's accurate, readable. The final thing to mention is not yet out, and I'm not sure everybody here knows about it. I wish, oops, wish I had a cover. I don't, and that is, I can move my people bar. Practice, Power, and the Forms of Life, Sartre's Appropriation of Hegel and Marx. Should be coming out from the University of Chicago Press, maybe 2021, probably 2022. And I'll just read the first paragraph. Jean-Paul Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason, released to great fanfare in 1960, has since then receded in philosophical visibility. As Sartre's reputation is now making a comeback, it is time for a reappraisal of his later work. In Practice, Power, and Forms of Life, philosopher Terry Pinkard interprets Sartre's late work as the fundamental reworking of his earlier ideas, especially in terms of his understanding of the possibility of communal action as genuinely free, which the French philosopher had previously argued was impossible. And then how that's related to show Sartre coming back to Hegel. So I'm looking forward to that. So yeah, Terry, thank you for all of this work and for just being a great mentor, teacher, scholar for all these years. I thought I'd say a couple words, because this is a conference on the philosophy of right, about the philosophy of right. Many of you are going to give some introductory remarks to situate your papers as we go through them. For those of you who don't have the table of contents memorized, I thought I would just sort of throw it out there to mention the sort of architectonic that we're all going to be kind of working against, working from. I'll say a couple words about the preface in a minute, but of course the philosophy of right is Hegel's, what Hegel calls objective spirit, which is the middle part of his account of spirit in the encyclopedia, which itself is the third part of the encyclopedia, the whole account of spirit that builds on the logic, it builds on the philosophy of nature and on the philosophy of subjective spirit. And one of course, the great challenges of any of us working on this is to sort of account for that enormous amount of work in the system prior to this text that Hegel constantly tells us is required or presupposed in order to even get started with the philosophy of right. And there's just a question of how in the world can you possibly do that in a preface or in an introduction. So he gives us a little bit of help in the introduction on the free will and the logic of the free will, and we'll be hearing about that today. Part one on abstract right, which my own essay, when I get around to it, finishing it will be on the volume, for the volume will be on abstract right, and sort of the beginning of the account and how that relates to history. Part two is his account of morality, modern morality. And then part three, the long section on Sittlichkeit, or what's translated as ethical life, including the family, civil society, the state. And then the account of the state is most known for constitutional law, but he actually includes in a very brief form his entire account of world history here right at the end of the philosophy of right. So we're sort of, in a way, sort of sandwiched between logic and history at the beginning and the end of the philosophy of right. And a lot of our work and a lot of the recent exciting work on the text has been trying to sort that out. I'll take sort of 30 seconds to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion, since I'm not giving a paper at this conference. And that's my own book, which is mainly a reading of the philosophy of right, came out this year from Oxford, Hegel's Value, Justice is the Living Good, where I try to sort of show that there's a line about value that runs throughout the philosophy of right from the beginning to the end. It gives us a kind of new insight into how it works, and then to sort of connect that to some issues in kind of inferentialist readings of Hegel. But I thought I should end these remarks by just mentioning a couple of the more famous or infamous passages from the philosophy of right preface. We didn't sort of like assign somebody to exactly to specific parts of the text. So I'm sure many of you, even in your titles, are referring to the preface, and I just mentioned the famous Doppelsatz: what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. This comes after Hegel's sort of polemic against some of the people at the time, particularly Fries. And it's a polemic that is, one of those moments that we all face at various points in this text, where you sort of, at one time, you know where Hegel's coming from, but you kind of cringe to when he says, yes, it's good that Fries got in trouble with the authorities. That's not something we exactly want to celebrate, even though we know why he annoyed Hegel so much. But Hegel then turns to sort of criticizing utopian accounts of political philosophy and saying, here's roads, jump here. You have to sort of demonstrate here and now what good your system is. And that sort of lends the sort of historical presentness of the account. Here's the rose, dance here. And the line that Jay Bernstein refers to in his title of his presentation today, to recognize reason as the rose and the cross of the present. That's our task as philosophers. And then finally, one of the most famous passages, and also though somewhat ambiguous, when philosophy paints its gray in gray, the shape of life has grown old and it cannot be rejuvenated, but only recognized by the gray in gray of philosophy. The owl of Minerva begins its flight only with the onset of dusk. All right, well, let me stop sharing there and go over a couple things about the conference and procedures before we get to our first presentation. So the presenters have been given anywhere from 5 to 25 minutes. Initially, it was going to be very short, and then once we realized how big our audience was going to be and thought that maybe not everybody had been able to read the papers, we said up to 25 minutes. So we're really going to try to enforce a stop on presentations at 25 minutes and then switch to Q&A. Questions are only going to be asked by the raise hand function. I think it's just too hard to try to manage a full-scale chat under these conditions. And we're going to try to give the first 3 questions to other contributors or presenters in the volume. But since we should have half an hour for each, at least half an hour for Q&A, that should leave plenty of time for other questions. I would also say, please wait till the speaker is done speaking to put your hand up. And we're going to have a short break, a couple minutes between each presentation for people to stretch their legs and so on, and then try to go pretty quickly on to the next one.